The wind in the high desert had a way of carrying silence. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the kind that pressed against the ribs, heavy and unrelenting, as though the land itself held its breath. Dust rolled across the single dirt street of Hollow Creek, a town that had seen better years, its storefronts sagging like tired men. Horses shifted restlessly at the hitching posts, and a Model T truck, long past its shine, sat rusting by the general store. Inside a weathered house at the edge of town, a lamp flickered against the walls, its glow barely pushing back the shadows. There sat Clara Whitfield, a widow of 37 years, her face marked by time and sorrow more than her age should have allowed. In her hands was a small envelope, edges worn from years of being handled, folded and put away again. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting across the front still bold but softened by touch. It was the last letter her husband had ever written. For 6 years it had sat in a drawer beside her bed, unopened. 6 years since the cavalry ride that ended in gunfire on the border. And 6 years since Clara had buried a coffin too light for the weight in her chest. People in town whispered that she kept the letter as a kind of shrine. Others said she was too afraid to face the words inside. The truth was simpler and heavier. Clara feared that opening it would be like tearing open the wound all over again. But tonight, under the restless hum of the wind and the loneliness that never truly left her, the letter felt heavier than ever in her palm. She set it on the table, smoothing it with trembling fingers. The lamp hissed as its oil burned low, and the quiet creak of the rocking chair filled the room. Outside, coyotes yipped in the hills. Clara drew a slow breath and let it go. She was tired. Tired of the whispers, tired of the waiting, tired of living in a life paused at the edge of grief. The door to her house rattled just then. A sharp knock against the wood. Clara started, stuffing the envelope beneath her shawl before standing. No one came by this late, not unless there was trouble. She opened the door to find Sheriff Dobbs, a stout man with a kind but weary face, his badge dulled with years of dust. "Evenin', Clara," he said, tipping his hat. "Didn't mean to bother you, just making my rounds. Thought I saw a light still on." Clara offered a tired smile. "I don't sleep much these days, Sheriff." He studied her a moment, as though weighing whether to ask the question he'd asked a dozen times before. Rumor had it he owned half the town, and what he didn't own, he bought or bullied. Clara's late husband had crossed him once, and some said that was why he never came home from the border patrol. Clara never knew if that was truth or just another cruel whisper. "I'll be careful," she said softly. Dobbs tipped his hat again and walked off into the night. Clara closed the door, leaning against it as the silence returned. She pulled the letter from her shawl and stared at it, her heart pounding. She thought of her husband's voice, deep, steady, always carrying warmth even when the world turned cold. She could almost hear him now, urging her to be strong. But strength had been a stranger these past years. Slowly, she sat again, the letter resting on the table between her hands. Her fingers traced the outline of her name on the front. "To my beloved Clara." The ink was faded, but the intent burned bright. Her eyes stung. She whispered to the empty room, "Not tonight. Maybe tomorrow." And yet she didn't put the letter away this time. She left it there on the table, staring back at her, daring her to open it. The clock ticked. The lamp sputtered. The night pressed close. Across town, at the saloon, laughter rose above the piano music, sharp and brash. Among the men playing cards was a young cowboy newly arrived in Hollow Creek. His name was James Callahan, though most called him Jimmy. He was lean, dust-stained, and carried himself with the kind of easy confidence that unsettled older men. No one in town knew yet that his path would soon cross Clara's, nor that her unopened letter would bind them together in ways neither could foresee. But for now, Clara sat in her lonely house, staring at the letter like it was both anchor and shackle. She didn't yet know that the moment she opened it, the course of her life, and the life of the stranger who had just ridden into town, would change forever. The night outside deepened. The coyotes grew quiet. Clara placed her hand over the letter and closed her eyes, whispering a prayer into the silence. And somewhere, fate shifted. Morning in Hollow Creek came slow, dragging sunlight across the desert like a tired hand smoothing a blanket. The first rays hit the sagging rooftops, painted the windows of the saloon gold, and stretched long shadows across the wooden boardwalks. Roosters crowed from behind chicken wire, and the clatter of hooves echoed as ranch hands pushed cattle toward the rail yard pens. Clara was already awake. She rarely slept past dawn, not since her husband's passing. But she didn't touch it. Not yet. That morning, while Clara swept dust from her porch, she noticed movement down the street. A rider, a young man in his late 20s, sat tall in the saddle, dust clinging to his boots, his shirt worn from miles on the trail. His hat shaded a face lean and angular, marked by the sun, but softened by a kind of restless youth. He slowed his horse as he neared the general store, dismounting with the ease of someone born to the saddle. He tied off his mare, patted her flank, and stepped inside. Clara caught herself watching, then shook her head. He was just another drifter. Hollow Creek had seen plenty come and go. They always came with stories, with charm, sometimes with trouble, and they always left before roots could take hold. Later that morning, Clara carried a basket toward the store. She needed flour, kerosene, a bit of sugar if the price wasn't too high. Inside, the air smelled of wood, coffee, and leather. Shelves sagged with tins and jars, and behind the counter stood Mr. Harlan, the shopkeeper, chewing on the stem of a pipe. The stranger was there too, standing at the counter, trading a few coins for supplies. He had a soft drawl, one that carried a hint of the South, but was tempered by long roads. Clara stepped quietly past, hoping to go unnoticed. But the stranger turned just as she brushed by. He tipped his hat politely. "Ma'am." Clara nodded, not meeting his eyes. Morning. It should have ended there, a polite exchange between strangers. But as Clara reached for a sack of flour, the shelf gave way, and the heavy bag tumbled. She gasped, stumbling back. But before the sack could burst against the floor, the stranger caught it against his chest. "Careful there," he said with an easy smile, setting the sack gently on the counter. Clara's cheeks warmed, though she scolded herself for it. "Thank you. These shelves have a mind of their own," he chuckled, adjusting his hat. "So do most things in towns like this. Name's James Callahan." She hesitated before answering. "Clara Whitfield." Recognition flickered across his face, but he hid it well. In a town as small as Hollow Creek, Everyone knew the widow Whitfield, the woman who still wore black 6 years on, who carried a sorrow like a badge. James only offered her a nod, nothing more. Mr. Harlan leaned forward on the counter. James here just signed on with the McAllister Ranch. Says he can ride, rope, and mend fence better than most. We'll see if he's true to his word. James smirked. A man's gotta eat. Figure Hollow Creek might give me a place to try. Clara collected her goods, offering no more than a polite before swinging into the saddle and riding toward the ranch lands. Clara walked home slower than usual. She told herself he was just another face. And yet, she couldn't quite push the image of his steady hands catching the flour sack from her mind. That evening, as the sky bled into shades of crimson and violet, Clara sat on her porch. She rocked in her chair, shawl pulled tight, the letter once again on the table beside her. The air smelled of dust and mesquite, and far off, coyotes began their lonely chorus. She was so deep in thought she didn't notice the rider until he was nearly at her gate. James dismounted, holding his hat respectfully in hand. "Evening, ma'am. Sorry to trouble you. On my way back from McAllister's, my horse threw a shoe. Saw your lantern and thought maybe you knew where a man could find the blacksmith." Clara gestured down the road. "Tom Parsons. His smithy's closed by now, but he'll be open come morning." James nodded, scratching the back of his neck. "Figures. Guess I'll camp nearby till then." He turned to leave, but Clara found herself speaking before she thought. "Wait. There's stew on the stove. If you don't mind plain food, you're welcome to a bowl." The words startled her as much as him. She rarely offered kindness to strangers. Yet something about the man, his quiet, his respectful distance, stirred a part of her she thought long buried. James's eyes softened. "That's mighty kind, Mrs. Whitfield. I'd be obliged." Inside, the two shared a simple meal: stew, bread, coffee. Conversation came in small pieces. Where James had ridden from, how the land looked in Texas compared to here, how cattle prices were falling all over. He didn't pry into her life, didn't ask about her husband, didn't mention the letter he surely noticed on the table. And for that, Clara was grateful. As he left, tipping his hat once more, Clara felt the quiet settle around her differently. Not the suffocating silence of grief, but a softer one, touched by possibility. When she sat again at the table, the letter seemed to look back at her with new weight. For the first time, she wondered if inside were words not meant to bind her to sorrow, but to free her from it. She touched the envelope with trembling fingers, her heart whispering a question she dared not yet speak aloud. Could love come twice in one lifetime? The wind carried no answer, only the creak of her rocking chair, and the memory of a cowboy's steady smile lingered in the night. For 6 years the envelope had sat untouched on the table by the window. It had yellowed in the sun, curled but never once dared to break the seal. The letter was the last thing her husband Thomas had left behind. That morning, Clara found herself staring at it again. Her hands trembled over the breakfast table, coffee cooling in her cup. She thought of James Callahan, the stranger who had eaten at her table last night, who had spoken with quiet courtesy, who hadn't once mentioned her widowhood. His presence lingered in her mind like the smell of wood smoke on clothes. Something about his calm had unsettled her, had stirred the locked chest of feelings she'd sworn never to open again. And now, with dawn stretching gold over Hollow Creek, Clara knew the time had come. She drew a sharp breath, reached for the letter, and slit the seal with the edge of a knife. The paper inside was folded twice. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar hand. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, it means I did not come home from the war. I reckon words written on paper can't soften the hurt, but I hope they can give you something else to hold on to when I am gone. You mustn't waste your life mourning me. Promise me that, Clara. Life is short and cruel, and I do not want my name to chain you to sorrow. If another man comes along who is kind and makes you smile again, do not turn away out of loyalty to a ghost. You gave me the happiest years of my life, and that is more than any man deserves. Now I want you to give your heart permission to find joy again, love again. Always yours, in this life and the next, Thomas. The words blurred as Clara's eyes filled. She pressed the letter to her chest, her breath hitching in broken sobs. For 6 years she had feared it contained pain, confession, or a request she could never honor. Instead, it gave her release. Her husband's final words weren't a chain, they were a key. By the time Clara dried her cheeks, the sun had risen high. She set the letter carefully back into its envelope and tucked it into her Bible where it belonged. For the first time in years, her chest felt light. That afternoon, Hollow Creek bustled with unusual life. Cattlemen shouted at the stockyards, children chased hoops down the boardwalk, and wagons rattled past the saloon where the piano man played a jaunty tune. Clara hadn't planned to leave the house, but she found herself walking into town, drawn by a restless energy. Near the smithy, she spotted James. He stood beside his mare, speaking with Tom Parsons, the blacksmith. James's shirt was rolled at the sleeves, sweat glistening on his arms as he held the horse steady. He looked younger in the daylight, as if the trail hadn't knocked the hope clean out of him like it had so many others. When he saw her, he tipped his hat. "Mrs. Whitfield, afternoon." "Clara," she corrected softly. The word felt strange, almost rebellious, but it tasted right. James blinked, then gave a small nod. "Clara." She lingered, watching Tom hammer a new shoe into shape. Sparks flew like fireflies in the dim smithy, ringing against the anvil. James held the horse calm with a hand against her neck, murmuring softly. There was gentleness in him, a patience that surprised her. "You've been on the trail a long while," Clara said at last. 3 years. James didn't look up from the horse. "Worked ranches, broke horses, did what I could. Never stayed one place too long." "Why here?" He shrugged. "Something about this town. Looks tired, but not finished. I reckon I know the feeling." Clara's lips curved before she realized it. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest she had come in years. Later that evening, Clara found herself writing at her table. Not a ledger, not a grocery list, but a letter. Her hand shook, unpracticed in the art of setting her thoughts down. "Dear Thomas," she wrote. "I opened your letter today. You told me not to waste my life in sorrow. I think I understand now. I met someone. No, I don't know what it means yet, but I thought you should know. I am trying to live again." Her pen hovered before she set it down. It was enough. She folded the page and tucked it beside his. a conversation separated by years but bound by love. That night, as Clara stepped onto her porch, the moon bathed Hollow Creek in silver. She thought of James, of the way he steadied the horse, the way he had respected her silences. She thought of Thomas, and how love, even in death, could still guide the living. For the first time in a long while, Clara rocked in her chair not out of habit, but with a heart that felt like it was beginning to beat again. And somewhere in the desert night, a coyote cried. A lonely sound, but not without hope. By midsummer, Hollow Creek baked under a relentless sun. Dust swirled down Main Street, coating storefronts and settling in the creases of every man's hat. Life moved on in its usual rhythm. Cattle in, cattle out. The saloon's piano, the preacher's Sunday sermons. But for Clara Whitfield, something had shifted. James Callahan had begun appearing in her days like a steady refrain. Sometimes James had a way of leaving space between words, as if he respected silence as much as speech. Clara found herself filling those silences with stories she hadn't told anyone in years. About her grandmother's recipes, her first dance with Thomas, the way the river used to freeze solid some winters. James listened with a patience that felt like balm to her weary soul. But the town was listening too. It started with glances at the mercantile. Women who once greeted Clara warmly now exchanged knowing looks when she walked in with James at her side. Men lingered by the hitching posts, muttering under their breath about a widow not keeping proper distance. Children who didn't know better whispered loud enough for all to hear. Miss Clara's got herself a cowboy friend. The first time Clara overheard it, she brushed it off. But whispers have a way of growing, feeding on themselves until they become part of the air you breathe. On a Saturday afternoon, as Clara selected fabric from Mrs. Daly's store, two churchwomen stood by the counter, pretending to study a spool of thread. "Shame, isn't it?" one murmured. "So soon after Thomas." "It's been 6 years," the other corrected. "All the same, folks don't forget a promise before God." Clara's cheeks burned. She set down the fabric and left without purchasing, her hands trembling all the way home. That night, she couldn't sleep. Thomas's letter lay folded in her Bible, granting her permission to live again. But the town, the very place where she had given and lost so much, seemed unwilling to release her from mourning. The judgment sharpened on Sundays. Clara still attended church, though the pews seemed harder than ever. Reverend Miller preached loud about loyalty and sin, his gaze resting too long on her pew. His wife offered polite smiles, but never invited Clara to the socials afterward. Where once she had been a pillar of the congregation, now she was a subject of cautionary whispers. James, for his part, seemed to sense the storm but never spoke of it directly. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Clara finally broke. "They think I've betrayed him," she whispered, her voice thin. "Thomas?" James asked gently. She nodded. "They don't say it outright, but I see it in their eyes. Like I'm stealing something from the grave. Like a widow is meant to wear grief until she joins her husband underground." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Do you believe that?" Clara's throat tightened. "I don't know. Some nights I still feel him here. And some nights I think he'd want me to be happy. But when the whole town looks at you like you've done wrong, it's hard to remember what you believe." James was quiet for a long time. "I never meant to bring you trouble. If my being here is a weight, say the word, and I'll ride on." The thought struck her like a blow. The silence that followed was unbearable. Finally, she shook her head, her voice breaking. "No, don't go." Something in her tone must have told him more than words ever could, because James only nodded, a quiet resolve in his eyes. But Hollow Creek wasn't finished with its whispers. The breaking point came one hot Sunday afternoon. Clara stepped out of church, the sun glaring down, when Mrs. Daly's boy, barely 12, called out across the steps. "Hey, Widow Whitfield, how long before you marry your cowboy?" The laughter that followed from the other children cut like a knife. Clara froze, her face pale, her hand gripping her Bible so tight her knuckles whitened. The adults hushed the boy, but no one corrected the cruelty. James was waiting by his horse. He saw her distress, saw the way the crowd avoided her eyes. Without a word, he crossed the street, took her Bible from her trembling hand, and offered his arm. Clara hesitated, then placed her hand in the crook of his elbow. Together, they walked past the crowd, heads high, the whispers following like shadows. That night, on her porch, Clara wept. Not because of shame, but because of the unfairness of it all. The way love, fragile and tentative, was treated like scandal. James sat beside her, silent until her tears slowed. Then he said, "I've carried burdens most of my life, Clara. I don't mind carrying this one too if it means I carry it with you." Her breath caught. For the first time she allowed herself to lean against him, her head resting against his shoulder. The cicadas sang, the night thick with heat, and for a moment Clara realized something startling. Judgment might break her reputation, but without James, loneliness would break her heart. But less the world beyond Hollow Creek was shifting too. The year was 1920, and change was riding fast across the West. Rumors spread of land disputes, of lawmen clashing with ranchers, of old grudges rekindled in smoke and fire. The town's whispers were only the beginning, and Clara knew, deep down, that the greatest test of her heart was yet to come. The trouble came not from gossiping mouths, but from the road that wound into Hollow Creek. Late in August, a band of outlaws drifted into the valley, rough men with hollow eyes and quick tempers. They'd been moving across counties, rustling cattle and shaking down small towns for whatever could be stolen. Hollow Creek had little to offer but its pride, yet that was enough to draw wolves. Clara heard of them first from James, who rode in one evening with dust in his beard and concern in his eyes. "They're camped by the river bend," he told her, tying off his horse. "5 of 'em, maybe more. Folks are nervous. Sheriff's only got 2 deputies left, one sick, one too green to hold a gun steady." Clara's heart tightened. Trouble had a way of testing not just the town but the people in it. She looked at James, standing tall but weary, and knew he was already making a choice. "Don't go looking for their fight," she whispered. James gave a half smile. "Sometimes a fight comes looking for you." The last weeks later, Hollow Creek stirred awake to the sound of hoofbeats and gunfire. The outlaws rode into town, whooping and firing shots into the sky. Windows shattered, doors slammed shut, and the once peaceful street became a hunting ground. Clara clutched the windowsill, watching chaos unfold. In the lamplight she saw James stride into the street, rifle in hand, steady as a man walking to church. He called out to the sheriff, rallying the few men who dared step outside. "Hold your ground," his voice carried. "They'll scatter if they know we stand together." Gunfire cracked, sharp and deafening. Smoke drifted between the buildings. Clara pressed her hand to her chest, whispering a prayer, not for safety but for strength. When one outlaw spurred his horse toward the boarding house, James raised his rifle and fired. The man tumbled, dust rising around him. The others wheeled, angry shouts filling the night. The fight was short but fierce. The sheriff took a bullet to the shoulder. Another man fell, and for a moment it seemed Hollow Creek might break. Then James, with grit born of hard years, pushed forward. He drove the outlaws back step by step, his voice and courage binding the men of the town together. By dawn, the bandits had fled, leaving 2 of their own behind. Hollow Creek woke to silence, broken windows, and wounded pride. Yet beneath it all was something else, respect. Clara stood on her porch as James returned, hat in hand, blood on his sleeve. She ran to him, her composure breaking for the first time in front of all the town. "You could have been killed," she said, voice shaking. James touched her cheek gently, despite the dirt and blood. So could they all. Sometimes a man doesn't choose what he stands for, the moment chooses him. Around them, townsfolk gathered. Where once there had been whispers, now there was a hush of acknowledgement. Men who had doubted James now nodded in gratitude. Women who had pitied Clara now looked at her with something softer, perhaps understanding, perhaps envy. Sheriff Harding, pale but upright, raised his good hand. "This town owes you its skin, Callahan. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The days that followed were quieter, but different. Clara noticed the change first at church. #@ meta. Sex 0.05. No longer did Reverend Miller's sermons linger on judgment. Instead, he spoke of courage, of sacrifice, of second chances. When Clara and James walked into the sanctuary together, heads turned, but no one whispered. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the prairie, Clara led James to the small cemetery at the edge of town. They stopped before a weathered headstone. Thomas Whitfield, 1876 to 1914. Beloved husband. Clara knelt, the grass cool beneath her knees. From her pocket she withdrew the folded letter, creased, worn, but still whole. With trembling hands she placed it at the base of the stone. "I kept my promise as long as I could," she whispered. "And you kept yours. You gave me freedom, even from the grave." Her voice faltered, but she went on. "I will always love you, Thomas. But I've learned that love doesn't end. It changes. And now it must carry me forward." Tears slid down her cheeks, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. James waited in silence, hat pressed to his chest. When Clara rose, she reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. Together, they stood before the grave, past and future meeting in the hush of twilight. That autumn, the town of Hollow Creek saw its first barn dance in years. Fiddles played, lanterns swung from beams, and laughter filled the air. Clara, dressed in a simple blue gown, stepped onto the floor with James at her side. The music swelled, and as they moved together, slow, steady, unashamed, Clara felt the eyes of the town upon them. But this time, there were no whispers, only acceptance. James leaned close, murmuring, "You dance better than you give yourself credit for." She smiled, eyes shining. "That's because I finally have the right partner." Life in the West was never easy. Storms still swept across the plains, and danger still lurked on the horizon. But for Clara and James, there was something stronger than fear or gossip. There was love, born of loss but tempered by courage. A love that didn't erase the past but honored it, while daring to build a future. And as the night wore on, music drifting into the warm prairie air, Clara realized the truth Thomas had written long ago. Love is not betrayal. Love is survival.